Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong. My name is Richard Kim.
And I suppose I'm Justin Tewald. So for our Chinese-speaking audience, 欢迎收听道可道中国哲学播客. So Richard, we have just finished recording a very long discussion of a very long dialogue known as the Robert Zhi Dialogue. It's from a chapter in the Zhuangzi that very few people actually believe was written by Zhuangzi, or very few people even think it's sort of consistent with the core chapters of the Zhuangzi. And it's an interesting one nonetheless, and it helps us to sort of illustrate the breadth, depth, and diversity of the classical Chinese tradition, because it's so unusual. Instead of the more moralistic stuff that we associate with Confucianism, or what some people think of as kind of classical Taoist writing, as paradoxical or mysterious or maybe even mystical writings, or the strange stories of the Zhuangzi that seem to celebrate a certain kind of natural harmony or what have you. This chapter seems to be something weirder. It's so much weirder, in fact, because it features this anti-hero type figure, Robert Zhi, engaged in a debate with Confucius. Neither of them come out looking very good, although Robert Zhi arguably ends up with the upper hand in the philosophical discussion. So that's what we're going to do today. And since it took so much time, we won't catch up as we normally do. And instead, we'll sort of introduce the passage instead.
Yep, Robert Zhi is chapter 29 of the Zhuangzi. It's a wild chapter. And right, as you just noted, Confucius, he gets kind of verbally dressed down by this notorious outlaw. And Robert Zhi basically just mocks Confucius and ridicules this Confucian way of life informed by virtue and ritual. And it's just an incredible and really interesting, and in some ways also humorous text. And I thought we had a great conversation with our guest speaker today, Stephen C. Walker. And I really enjoyed the conversation, and I think the listeners will as well.
Yes, absolutely. So he'll join us for part 2 of the show after the intermission music.
All right, so we are back and now joined by our very special guest for today, Dr. Stephen C. Walker, who holds a PhD from the University of Chicago in philosophy of religion and has published much on classical Chinese philosophy, especially on the Zhuangzi. I've had the pleasure of meeting Stephen earlier this year at the Midwest Conference in Chinese Thought, and he gave a terrific talk, and you could just tell that his mind is full of novel thoughts. And we both thought, Justin and I, that he would be a wonderful guest to have, especially to discuss the Robert Zhi Dialogue from chapter 29 of the Zhuangzi. Hi, Stephen.
Hey, guys. Good to be here.
Really nice to have you, Stephen. I think actually the two of us go back quite a ways, although neither of us may remember exactly where it began. I vaguely remember getting an email from someone who was considering going to the divinity school at the University of Chicago, but still, at the time at least, kind of saw himself as a philosopher and was trying to weigh the option of going to a PhD program in philosophy instead or something like that. And I was either a baby professor who had just graduated from Chicago, or maybe I was still at Chicago. I can't quite remember. Does that sound at all familiar to you?
It sounds somewhat familiar. My memories dating back to the late 2000s are a little bit fragmentary. So as far as I'm concerned, you and I have always been in correspondence in one form or another. One slight point, I wasn't transitioning from training as a philosopher into what I'm doing right now. I started as a sinology person. So I'm an East Asian studies into Chinese philosophy person. I guess it's a bit more common for people to be philosophy into Chinese philosophy in terms of their professional development.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah,
I took the more text and history route at first.
Yeah, good. So it's great to have you here. You've written a piece on the Robert Zhi story, which we will link in the show notes. Because the entire dialogue that we are calling the Robert Zhi story is much too long to read, we decided that we'll break out our conversation into 6 sections that will cover some of the key themes. I wanted to give you a kind of quick plot synopsis, and it'll be very quick, I promise, but I want you to know what action to expect in what follows. So basically, believe it or not, Confucius makes an appearance in this story, and Confucius basically finds himself convinced that he should go try to talk to this brutal crime lord, for lack of a better way of describing him, Robert Zhi. So he does so, and Robert Zhi reluctantly agrees to meet with him, but then really gives him a dressing down. He both criticizes Confucius himself for sort of the way of life that he lives and everything he represents, and also gives a kind of philosophical justification for those criticisms. And then Confucius leaves with his tail between his legs, so to speak. He leaves Robert Zhi feeling defeated and deflated. That's the short version. Just in terms of the philosophical kind of takeaways, the kind of thematic analysis of the dialogue, I'll just say this much. It's a little crude, and maybe we can refine it later. I think that both Robert Zhi and Confucius come out of this dialogue looking like not good people. Certainly Robert Zhi and his bandit lifestyle doesn't look good. But Confucius looks like a kind of cheap salesperson or charlatan of morality, right? So he's peddling something, and we'll call it morality, but it's in the service of his own interests and of the interests of a kind of landed nobility, maybe the powerful, the wealthy, and so on. So they're both bad people, but at least Robert Zhi knows it, and he seems comfortable with his so-called badness, right? So in some sense, he's more authentic, maybe, than Confucius in his badness. And Confucius, by contrast, ends up looking much more like a phony or a hypocrite than Robert Zhi. All right, so that's the preview.
Yeah, so we're going to read aloud some key lines and offer a plot synopsis of each section. And we'll take turns doing this, but we'll also have freewheeling conversation about any idea or point or argument. So I'm going to start with this first part of the Robert Zhi dialogue, and this is where Confucius talks with Robert Zhi's older brother. Okay, so Confucius hears about this infamous bandit, Robert Zhi, who terrorized the feudal lords and made off with their wives and daughters, and decides to visit him, perhaps to persuade him or to reform him. And on the way, he stops to talk with Zhi's older brother. Now, the brother warns Confucius not to go. Zhi is smart, strong, beyond reason, and hostile to moralists. And a little quote from the dialogue itself. His mind gushes like a fountain, and his thoughts are like gusts of wind. I must say, I'm not entirely sure exactly what is meant by those lines.
Yeah.
So maybe we can talk about that. But yeah, that's from the passage. And now Confucius doesn't heed the warnings of Robert Zhi's older brother and just presses on. He takes his two students, Yan Hui and Zhi Gong, and presses on and goes to him to win him over through his moral teachings.
Yes. So Confucius wants to do for Robert Zhi what he's trying to do with lots and lots of people, according to the traditional stories, which is convert them to the Confucian way, convince them to become better people. And Robert Zhi's older brother says, don't bother. I mean, that's crazy. You're not going to succeed. And that's where this description that Richard quoted comes in. And this quote, by the way, is from the Brooks Zipporah translation of the Zhuangzi. So Zipporah translates the key lines as sort of in praise of Robert Zhi, saying that his mind, Robert Zhi's mind, gushes like a fountain, and his thoughts are like gusts of wind. So there's a kind of flowing quality, I think, to the way his mind works. But anyway, Confucius is not dissuaded. He's still committed to trying to convert Robert Zhi to a better way of life.
Yeah, anything to add to that, Stephen? Would you like to say a word about what you think these phrases mean? Mind gushes like a fountain, and his thoughts are like gusts of wind. I mean, it suggests something like there's a kind of tumultuousness to his character, maybe. There's a certain kind of power also, a kind of strength to it. I'm not entirely sure what was being meant here.
In contexts like these, I really like the English idiom force of nature. So I think that Liuxia Ji is basically saying of Zhi, this guy is really formidable. He's like a storm. He's like an earthquake. Be careful what you wish for. Like, do you know what you're getting yourself into? Now, Robert Zhi's brother seems plainly convinced that Zhi engages in wrongdoing. I mean, he uses the phrase, disputational dexterity is more than sufficient to cover up his wrongdoing. But the fact that Robert Zhi may be in the wrong, from his brother's point of view, has no connection with whether Confucius is likely to be successful in making him do anything. Basically, Confucius needs to know what he's up against and how he may be just overmatched, whether or not what Robert Zhi is doing is ultimately wrong.
Yeah. Maybe this is a little bit too much of a digression, but I find it fascinating that the story sets up Robert Zhi as this guy who is so heedless of conventional norms and the normal sources of moral pressure, we might say, that he doesn't even listen to his older brother, who on a sort of traditional view is thought to be a kind of moral educator, someone supposed to wield influence over a younger brother. He doesn't listen to his father. So that already is quite shocking. And then it's just kind of weird that despite that fact, Confucius thinks that he, a total stranger, is going to strut in and somehow sell Robert Zhi on this new way of life.
Yeah, there's a kind of maybe arrogance that is being suggested by Confucius's thought that he can be the one, who could do better than even his older brother. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
After all, he's already been so successful converting the feudal lords, right?
Yeah, exactly. All right, so that's section 1. Section 2 is, we're calling it Confucius meets Robert Zhi. So that describes the sort of key action. So here's what happens. Basically, Confucius arrives bringing gifts and finds Robert Zhi eating human livers, of all things. It's sort of a trope for bandits and villains, warriors to eat the livers of their enemies in these old texts. So Confucius arrives and he lavishes Robert Zhi with flattery, calling him a man of great abilities who could rival the sage kings if only he embraced moral virtue. And he suggests that Robert Zhi should lay down his weapons and return to a normal life. A normal life understood as a kind of familial life, one that's ritually proper. And he seems to be essentially coming to him with a big inducement or payoff. He has something he's willing to use to induce him to give up his robber ways. And that inducement is essentially a big estate and territory to rule. So he would become someone who's quite successful by the conventional standards of the times. He would be something like a feudal lord with his own territory and all the esteem and reputation and all the honor and other benefits that brings.
And as in any sales pitch scenario, we can ask what Confucius expects in return. And he's sort of vague. He's nonspecific about this, but he basically says, if you listen to me, then I can make this happen for you. That could be as simple as, I can make you this one-time deal. Like, for whatever reason of my own, I can convince all of the aristocrats of the land to make you one of them, motives unspecified. I think I'm more interested in a kind of maximalist interpretation of if you listen to me, which is if you take me on as your coach, if you take me on as your advisor, then I can make this happen for you. Because an essential element of the flattery here is that, according to Confucius, Robert Zhi essentially already has all of the key skills and competences of a great political leader. He just lacks title. Like, his position in the world isn't quite right to make people respect him in the way that they would respect him as soon as he was like a duke or a baron or some other VIP title, maybe more familiar to our own tradition, as I think this translates quite well. I mean, the difference in skill set may not be so great. The difference in title is the thing between the people we revile most and the people we look up to the most.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. There are a couple nice lines from this section, which maybe are worth reading. This is Robert Zhi to Confucius. Anyone who can be regulated with promises of profit and admonished with slick words is what I would call a stupid, ignorant, ordinary sort of person. When you tell me all about the great territory and multitude of subjects I will have, you are trying to regulate me with promises of profit and make me tame like an ordinary person. How could any of that last? So he's reframing the incentives or the inducement that Confucius offers as a way of kind of trying to regulate him, as he says. Offer him profit, and that will regulate him and tame him and make him an ordinary person. So it seems like the premium here for him is remaining untamed and unregulated.
Well, I would add, part of being tamed and regulated is accepting offers of this kind. So we're surrounded by people who make us various kinds of offers of higher status, offers of career success, offers of social success. People will love you, you'll be respected, blah, 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 blah. And you can always ask, when people are making promises of this kind, what's in it for them? And, with somebody like Robert Zhi, it's always transparent what's in it for him because he's a robber. There's no ambiguity to what he's doing. With someone like Confucius, you can raise the question, though, and obviously Confucius is making a living. Confucius is portrayed as somebody who relies economically on things his students give him, at least in the context of this dialogue and Zhi's framing of him. I don't know to what extent the historical Confucius was economically dependent on fees or anything, but it's not important for purposes of Robert Zhi's own perspective. Like, Confucius wouldn't be exerting all of this effort. He wouldn't be a reformer. He wouldn't be a crusader unless there was something in it for him that would justify putting himself at so much risk. And essentially what Robert Zhi is saying is that if the promise is unrealistic, if the ads are misleading, if there's misleading advertising going on, you'd have to be a sucker to buy into it. So Robert Zhi is just not going to buy into it because, A, he doesn't think Confucius could actually help him attain any of those things. Like, there's a sort of practical problem. Like, Confucius doesn't seem to be the man who could actually do this for him. B, even if Confucius could do this for him, even if somehow Robert Zhi could turn into Baron Zhi and get like a whole royal court and like 10 times as many subjects and have hymns written in his honor and so on. Even if he were to get all that, it's not worth it from his point of view, because have you looked at the lives of the rich and famous in a culture like the one Robert Zhi lives in? It's practically a horror show of mortal peril. The more power somebody has, I mean, in a political system based primarily on force, force is the omnipresent reality that VIPs have to deal with. I mean, Robert Zhi has to deal with it. He's a VIP on a small scale. He has 9,000 followers. What if he had 900,000 followers? How much more force would he have to be reckoning with in his daily life, just trying to survive? That's why for him, it's a bad deal, even if Confucius can deliver on it. And by the way, Confucius cannot deliver on it.
Yes, right. Okay, that's interesting. So when you read the passage in context, one thing that comes across relatively clearly is that he thinks even if he were to acquire this stuff, it would in some sense burden him or tie him down, right? For example, if he acquired power and prestige and position or wealth, those are then things he would worry about and he'd have to maintain and protect from others who would covet it, right? So he's better off just sort of consuming what he wants when he wants it. But your point is actually, it's not even clear that Confucius can deliver all those goods to him. So he's really making 2 points against Confucius. A, I'm not sure I believe you that you can deliver all these goods. And B, even if I could get them, I wouldn't want them.
This is almost a version of that sardonic phrase in American culture, those who can't teach. Confucius is teaching people how to have successful, happy lives, but he is obviously incapable of doing that himself. So you'd have to be foolish to listen to him. Again, assuming that you're approaching Confucius's teaching in terms of a sort of cost-benefit analysis or a good that's being advertised for your consumption.
Yeah. To me, that's still one of the stranger things about the dialogue is that Confucius is so shameless in presenting everything as a cost-benefit analysis.
There's an alternative possibility, which is that he's being cunning. That Confucius has made the entirely rational calculation that this is the only way he could ever appeal to Robert Zhi. Like, Robert Zhi obviously doesn't care about benevolence and righteousness, so Confucius isn't going to talk about benevolence and righteousness. Robert Zhi doesn't care about the sage kings, so Confucius is not going to talk about the sage kings. The only thing Confucius has left is basically promises of more prosperity and more strength and all of that. But that's specifically the domain in which Confucius has nothing to offer.
Yeah, good. All right, so that now brings us to section 3, which we're calling Robert Zhi Describes the Golden Age or State of Nature. I'll let those of you who've thought more about this dialogue set it up if you want, but I'll just say one thing quickly. In the genre that we're in, which is sort of classical Chinese texts, it's not uncommon for people to tell their version of history. And oftentimes in their version of history, there's something that we might call a golden age. And it's very important to sort of establish when you think that golden age happens. Does it happen before the sage kings come along and bring us the benefits of civilization and culture, reading and writing, that sort of thing? Or does it happen after, right? And then how long does it last and all those things? Those are the sorts of details you're supposed to pay attention to when you read an account of history in some of the canonical Chinese texts. So anyway, Stephen was going to tell us about Robert Zhi's account of history.
Yeah, and before I launch into this, I will mention to listeners, don't be discouraged by all the names you're about to hear.
Yeah.
The names of battles and emperors, they fundamentally don't matter. The only thing you need to know in advance is these great kings and great occurrences are all sort of stock tropes drawn from common ancient Chinese discussions of the past. These are iconic political leaders who are typically looked up to in some way.
Yeah,
That's all you need to know about these guys. So right after saying that it's a bad deal and he doesn't even believe Confucius can deliver, Robert Zhi launches into the following. I've also heard that in ancient times, animals were many, but humans were few. So the people had to stay clear of them by living in nests up in the trees. In the daytime, they gathered chestnuts, and at night they roosted up in their nests. That's what got them the name nesters. In ancient times, the people knew nothing about clothing. In the summer, they gathered much firewood, which was used in the winter to keep them warm. That's what got them the name survival savants. In the time of Shen Nong, people fell asleep on the spot without ceremony and woke to where they were, all wide-eyed. They knew who their mothers were, but not who their fathers were. They commingled with the bucks and does, plowing for their food, weaving for their clothes, with no thought of harming or being harmed. This is the full flourishing of utmost human excellence, of our utmost intrinsic virtuosity. But then the Yellow Emperor, unable to realize this virtuosity to the utmost, instead went to war with Churyo in the wilds of Zhuolu, until blood was flowing for 100 miles around. Then Yao and Shun arose, setting up their throng of ministers. Thereafter, Tang banished his own lord, and King Wu murdered Zhou. From that point onward, the strong have oppressed the weak, and the many have violently imposed themselves on the few. Everyone from Tang and Wu onward has been just another disruptor of the people. And I think one way to rephrase all of those names at the end is, for thousands and thousands of years, human history has been a carnival of disasters and bad leadership that started in the distant past. If we were to look for any golden age of mankind where people were actually happy and healthy, it would have to be thousands of years in the past before all of that started happening.
Yes, that's right. So the decline of history begins with the Yellow Emperor, with these sort of so-called sage kings, or figures that set up these social hierarchies, which they then use to oppress people, oppress the weak, violently impose themselves on the few, and so on. So every ruler, essentially, since that time, has been a disruptor of the people. Yeah, so he's really turning the usual Confucian, or we might just say the more conventional history as it was understood back then, on its head. These sage kings aren't sage kings. They're not actually supremely virtuous or moral paragon type rulers. Instead, they're oppressors. And then I just wanted to call attention to something that I find just quite moving about the description. It speaks to me, more than 2 millennia later. In the time of Shennong, a kind of agrarian sage figure, he says, people fell asleep on the spot without ceremony and woke to where they were all wide-eyed. Okay. So I think he's essentially saying people slept easily, they were able to fall asleep quickly and they woke up fully refreshed, having slept the whole night, more or less, and sort of ready to face the day. I just think that's a beautiful sentiment. It just goes to show that it's not just us in the modern era that suffer from this tendency to go to bed ruminating about all the things that you have to do the next day, or all the things you're angry about, or what have you.
I'm content with that being part 3.
Okay.
So part 4 consists of Robert Jur's account of the pantheon of heroes that has populated human historical consciousness ever since that time. So I mentioned that people like the Yellow Emperor and Yao and Shun are stereotypes of virtue. And it turns out there's a lot more than them. We've got dozens of stereotypes of virtue. And I think that's true for all values of the word we. In any time and place, we have various agreed upon pantheons of individuals who are supposed to have done great things, who you're supposed to look up to, take very seriously, and so on. And I think the way to summarize the next page or so of highly specific historical examples is to say that Robert Jur is trying to take a sledgehammer to the pantheon of good men as stereotypically discussed in classical Chinese culture. So before I summarize exactly what's wrong with them, because it's really interesting, I want to say there's one sentence Robert Jur says in the midst of all of this polemicizing that is really interesting. I think it's interesting for the point of the dialogue as a whole. He says to Confucius, "No one could be more of a robber than you." So I think this came up already. It's crucial throughout this dialogue that Robert Jur doesn't try to justify himself. He's not promoting anything he does with his lifestyle as good or justified in any way. The argument he's trying to make is that Confucius is on par with him. Confucius is not better or different in kind. Confucius is also a businessman who has a finite amount of success getting what he wants and has variable effects on the people around him. It's just that unlike Robert Jur, Confucius lies about it constantly. And in that sense, he's a more insidious kind of criminal in Robert Jur's eyes than Robert Jur himself is, because people don't really know they're being had. I think a con man is a good comparison. And so we can ask, as Robert Jur is taking a sledgehammer to the pantheon of great men, what is the significance of that claim sort of echoing in the background? No one could be more of a robber than you. I'll sort of circle back to this once we've talked about the sledgehammering.
If I could just underscore something there, it's sort of like Robert Jur. We said earlier he's like a crime boss. He's sort of like the mob boss who's forthright about what he wants from you. So he says, I have a kind of protection racket going on. Your business pays me money and we quote unquote protect you, which is to say we do protect you from certain threats, but we also protect you from ourselves, right? We're not going to interfere with your business. But contrast, Confucius is a robber without admitting it, right? So he's stealing from people. He's stealing from his customers, but he's not so forthright about it.
Yeah. So the sledgehammering is delightful. I'm going to pull out 2 principal themes from the sledgehammering. Theme number 1, people are way more complicated than they would need to be for the heroes versus villains framework to make any sense. So whether we're talking about some person you happen to look up to in your village, or like the founder of your civilization, or some great martyr to a cause, take any of those people who did great things, look at them from more than one angle. Try to come at them the way their contemporaries did, like the ones who found them problematic and so on. Look at them in their off hours, and you're going to find, I mean, they're not exactly disasters any more than you or I are a disaster, but to the extent that human beings are moral disasters and always have a dark underbelly, even in their best moments, that's true of the heroes too. There are all kinds of shortcomings in your heroes. There's that phrase, never meet your heroes. Like, there are all kinds of unintended consequences to what these great leaders did. And particularly given the political and military focus of the Chinese pantheon of great men, this is really obvious, because how do you achieve notoriety as a political or military leader unless via conflict and domination? Anytime you have enemies or subjects, obviously we're in a morally complex scenario, not a morally simple one. Otherwise, there wouldn't be stratification and there wouldn't be wars in which to prove one's heroism in the first place. And trying to sort of tie a bow around Robert Jur's point here, I wrote to myself, heroes are more dangerous to our minds than villains are, because you never forget what's wrong with villains, but you typically forget what's wrong with your heroes.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the classical Chinese texts, they succumb to this temptation to depict their cultural heroes as flawless. But it seems like the author of this dialogue is disillusioned, or anyway, recognizes that even the so-called, heroes of the past, and these kind of mythological figures, must be complicated, must have downsides, just as the people that one might be tempted to lionize in one's own time.
So that's one swing of the sledgehammer.
Yeah.
These guys are too complicated for a simple analysis. The other swing of the sledgehammer is what I'll call self-destruction or self-sacrifice. So the idea here, in about half of the examples he brings out, is that we tend to be drawn to praise people as conspicuously virtuous in direct proportion to how much they suffered. So if they endure terrible things for the sake of what they believe in, I mean, iconically, both in Robert Jur's culture and in our culture, iconically, imprisonment or death at the hands of regimes that we regard as unjust. The more a person endures suffering for the sake of what they believe in, the more larger than life they seem. And it can feel awfully strange and sort of eye-narrowing to think for a moment about the role of suffering in our protocols for picking people out as exemplary. Because to the extent that people who are exemplary are supposed to be exemplars of something, and to the extent that they've been picked out because they were shot, for instance, or because they labored so hard throughout their life and never saw the fruits during their own lifetime, it's a really weird way to pick somebody out as an exemplar, because it seems to be implying that if you are going to be like them, you have to start living in a way that brings suffering upon yourself too. You have to endanger yourself. You have to put yourself at risk. Again, that's only one possible interpretation of what it would mean to emulate such people, but I think it's a prominent aspect of the call to be more like so-and-so.
Yeah. So, for example, Robert Jur says of some of these kind of supremely altruistic or self-sacrificial cultural heroes, the ones who suffer virtuously, like Bo Yi and Shu Qi, he says that all of them were trapped in the net of reputation and names, looking lightly on death, with no thought of what originally nourishes and preserves the life in them. So the way he describes them, he says trapped in the net of reputation and names. So they were kind of worried about their reputation, their name recognition, and in so doing, regarded too trivially the life itself, right? They'd made death a kind of trivial thing and didn't pay sufficient attention to what nourishes and preserves the life in them. So it's like they have the wrong values, the wrong priorities.
Well, wrong from what point of view? I think what Robert Jur is suggesting is it's kind of wrong from their own point of view, isn't it? Isn't it perverse to pursue a self-destructive path in life? Normally, when we or our friends and loved ones are acting in self-destructive ways, we try to stop them. We prefer that people we care about live long and healthy and happy. And so it's peculiar that we are culturally conditioned to look up to people who didn't under specific conditions that our culture lays down. So another thing I wrote for myself to sort of keep myself on topic is, okay, on the one hand, you have getting yourself killed for the sake of your principles, or like getting yourself killed because of duty or for a cause. On the other hand, you have getting yourself killed through incompetence. The Darwin Awards came to mind. So like getting yourself killed is something, I mean, unfortunately, many paths can lead to it. What then is the difference? Again, Robert Jur is sort of laying this down as a spicy challenge. So you take two people who were equally self-destructive, one of them through a kind of incompetence we can readily recognize, one of them through a more subtle kind of incompetence that is harder to recognize and that is systematically selected for by the teachings of people like Confucius. So once again, just as Robert Jur is a robber, but Confucius is also a robber who lies about it, I think from Robert Jur's own point of view, some people are self-destructive and get themselves killed because they don't know the way. And other people do too, but nobody knows this about them because they've been conditioned to praise them, again, sort of for reasons unknown. Who benefits from our habit of praising people who bring so much suffering upon themselves?
I guess, yeah, so there's something right about this critique of those who just seem to be bent on self-destruction. But I guess I thought most people admire these kinds of figures like, let's say in the past, like Socrates or, I don't know, MLK, right? I mean, because they were pursuing some noble ends, and then they, as a kind of a byproduct, they weren't aiming to die, but they, in the pursuit of these goals, they were willing to die for various causes. So isn't that the main reason why we find these figures attractive? Not because they're just self-destructive or, I mean, if they just aim to suffer for its own sake, there would be something bizarre about that. And that wouldn't be noble at all. But they're aiming for things that are worth dying for. But of course, if they aim for things that are not worth dying for, then we wouldn't be very inspired by that at all, I think.
Well, what about all the people who have comparable motivations but don't get killed in the process?
Well, I guess, yeah, I mean, because there's luck involved, right? I mean, just because you didn't die doesn't mean that you weren't committed. But, the clearest cases are where someone, I think what we admire is maybe the commitment and the willingness to die for these causes. And then, of course, it's better ultimately that they don't die. But yeah, I guess we do kind of factor in, like, we find them even more inspiring because, well, at least we know for sure that these people were willing to die for these causes because, well, also they did die and then suffered a lot.
Yeah. I'm glad you articulated that worry, Richard, because it cries out to be articulated. So I think maybe we can begin to see how Robert Jur might respond to that particular worry when we look at what he has to say about hypocrisy and living authentically and stuff like that, which he will do in the next section.
Actually, I think two more things should be covered in section 4 first.
Oh, sure.
I think I can do them quickly. Another thing Robert Jur does along the way of attempting to demolish, to take a sledgehammer to the cultural pantheon, is he turns the spotlight on Confucius himself and on the people directly affected by Confucius. So, as already noted, Confucius travels from lord to lord to lord, at least in the stereotypical literature about him that this is definitely reflecting. And he is basically unsuccessful the whole way through. And he doesn't get killed in the process, but the fact that he is frequently faced with the possibility of death is part of what makes him admirable, quite along the lines we've been talking about so far. So we know that nobody has, from Robert Jur's point of view, we know that nobody has actually bought what Confucius is selling yet, except his disciples. So we know two things about his disciples. Number one, they share in Confucius's wretched, dangerous, frustrating life. And number two, we know that one of them actually did do the glorious thing, confronted a lord who, for whatever reason he judged to be unrighteous, tried to unseat him in a coup. The coup failed, and now his corpse is hanging pickled in the in the citadel of that lord.
Yeah.
Exactly. So Confucius's only verifiable effect on people close to him is to put them in danger and keep them frustrated, much as he himself is. He hasn't been able to deliver these goods to himself or to anybody who directly relies on him.
Yeah, good. All right. And I think there's more material to respond to Richard's important worry about the depiction of these kind of cultural self-sacrificial heroes in the next section. And the next section is section 5. We're calling that Robert Jur Does Philosophy. I'm not sure if that's the correct description of it, but that's what we'll go with. And I'm just going to read it for you. So here's Robert Jur. Now let me tell you the truth about the innate dispositions of human beings. And that phrase, innate dispositions, is a translation of the Chinese phrase qing, qinggan de qing. Our eyes want to see colors. Our ears want to hear sounds. Our mouths want to discern flavors. The energies of our aspirations want to wax to their fullness. The greatest longevity humans can hope for is 100 years. Medium longevity is 80 years. Lesser longevity is 60 years. If you subtract all the time lost on sickness, pain, bereavement, mourning, worry, and trouble, the time left when a man can open his mouth and laugh is no more than 4 or 5 days out of a month. Heaven and earth are inexhaustible, but death ends each human life at a definite time. If you take all of this limited time and prop it up in the midst of inexhaustible time of heaven and earth, it's just a brief, sudden flash, no different from a Qiling unicorn galloping past a crack in the wall. Anyone who is unable to gratify their ambitions and desires and consume what serves their physical survival has failed to comprehend the Tao, or Ziporn uses the word course to translate Tao. This is the Tao that's sometimes translated as way. Robert Jur goes on, I reject everything you say. Get out of here. You, scram. Don't say any more about it. Your Tao is an insane fixation, a mass of deceitful, crafty, vain, hypocritical hooey. It cannot be used to keep the genuine in us complete. Even talking about it is not worthy of my time. So, yeah, there's some familiar themes that I think people will recognize just because they resonate with how we think about life sometimes when we manage to take this sort of big picture perspective. Life is just a brief flash in the pan, or as he says, a kind of unicorn galloping past a crack in a wall. So from the big picture perspective, it's also brief. And notice how much of that little time that we have, we spend on sickness, pain, bereavement, mourning, worry, and trouble, right? He notes that actually it's only 4 or 5 days of the month that you're able to just sort of laugh in this open-mouthed way. That, again, is this sentiment that I think speaks to us across the millennia, especially now, right? So anyway, how do we understand this passage? What are we supposed to take away from it?
This is the ancient Chinese YOLO, right?
Yeah. YOLO is an acronym. You only live once. That's the YOLO sentiment.
Yeah. So the thing I want to say here, just to start things going, is I don't see any direct relationship to Confucian ritual practice or moral cultivation being a direct generator of inauthenticity. I tend to read this more as a challenge along the following lines. Given that people are fragile, sensitive, organic bodies that are filled with desires and appetites, that's kind of where everything is rooted. It's like the buck stops there in terms of whether you would find a life worth living for yourself. Now, he does include things we would normally call physical sense organs like eyes and ears. He also uses this phrase, the energies of our aspirations want to wax to their fullness, which I find really interesting because it's so vague. Again, what I tend to see going on in this paragraph is the idea that whatever your aspirations are, whatever you want out of life, there's kind of no way to decide that in the abstract. Everybody's going to be different. The thing that is fixed from person to person to person is that whatever it is, that's what you need to be focusing on. And a lot of the time, among the things that we care about and want in a visceral, vital way are things like the well-being of our loved ones, or, various other things that sort of intermesh with morality as conventionally conceived. There's also a whole lot of other physical and aesthetic stuff that doesn't. And for Robert Jur, all of that stuff is fundamentally on the same level because it's about the responsiveness of organic faculties.
Yeah, I did wonder about, what about like our social desires, our nature as social creatures, and the need for friendships? I mean, that's not quite mentioned here, right? I mean, or is there like a line that seems to leave that open? That seems like an important part of who we are. I mean, this is really a kind of anthropology or some conception of what human beings are really like fundamentally. And the social aspect, which I see as, closely tied to morality in some ways. Yeah, that part seems to be missing here.
Yeah, and just to build on Richard's point, the description of people in the state of nature, which seems to be presented as a good way of living, right, has people who basically know their mothers but not their fathers, right? And that's a familiar idea of what the state of nature is like for people who want to assume that people are not interacting very much in that state, right? So, of course, they have to know who their mother is because there's a period of time where they're dependent on some adult.
Well, wait a minute. I mean, there are still conditions in any civilized society where people don't know who their father is. That's just a reference to there being no rules about who you can sleep with, rules about paternity, and so on.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. But
I mean, in the primitive utopia that's being sketched a few minutes ago in our conversation, people seem to be interacting socially. They have families, they have a rudimentary economy. And I mean, let's just take on the entire Mencian claim about human nature all at once and see how Robert Jur can interact with it. So given that what the Mencian claim about human nature is like it's a family of possible views rather than any one self-evident view, I'm going to say it at least has to prominently feature the following claim. at the organic, visceral level that Robert Jur is talking about, we have certain impulses. Let's just talk about three impulses that really matter. We have an impulse to take care of some other people sometimes. We have an impulse to take care. So that's the first heart. We have an impulse to see ourselves in a certain way and to behave in a certain fashion that comports with our self-regard. That's the second heart. And we also have some kind of innate drive or impulse that yields things like politeness and decorum. I mean, in different passages of Mencius, it's articulated differently, but let's say that people find it pleasing to be cooperative. They sometimes find it pleasing to defer. I think, and this is a claim I've enjoyed making for years about Robert Jur can just take that in stride, because he's going to say, okay, you have all of these physical desires, you have all of these aesthetic desires, and you have all of these social desires for things like cooperating with people, having self-confidence and self-regard, taking care of certain people. How you doing at that? Like, how is your life working out? Have you figured out how to satisfy yourself in a consistent, stable way? Now, this is why it's so important to shine the spotlight on Confucius himself in the dialogue, because the claim is going to be that, like, if all of these desires and impulses are more or less desires and impulses, if they're physical and aesthetic and social impulses, the fact that you're succeeding in one area doesn't mean that you're not failing in another area. Like, maybe Confucius does have extremely high self-regard and constantly acts in ways that strike him as having integrity, along the lines of the second heart in Mencius. The fact that he's constantly hungry and exhausted and afraid is compatible with that, and it means that his life as a whole is still very problematic. And you could say the same thing about people who are not exhausted and not afraid, etc. All impulses count, whether they're social or otherwise, in determining how well someone is taking care of themselves.
Just to follow up on your thoughts there, the possible critique or criticism might be from Robert Jur is that Confucians, or maybe Mencius, are prioritizing and giving far too much weight to a certain domain of our inclinations or fundamental urges. Is that the way you're thinking about this? Because, yeah, you suggested, Robert Jur can fully acknowledge all those other kinds of inclinations as well. It's just that he's calling into question, why are those so much more important? Did I get that right? Or maybe I misunderstood the idea.
I don't think I'd put primary emphasis there. I think I'd put secondary emphasis on it. The primary emphasis, sort of thinking out loud right here, the primary emphasis for Robert Jur is, in any moral cultivation profession of the kind that Confucius and Mencius both embody, the call is for their audience to improve and commit in some way. Now, granted, they're being called upon to improve and commit specifically around what we're calling the social or moral impulses around the other ones. I think that Robert Jur's primary cynicism concerns that call to improve, because the call to improve is fundamentally ungrounded. It's based on splitting people and splitting history into good people and bad people, good behaviors and bad behaviors, in a way that's very schematic. And it draws its inspirational character from the fact that people can thrill to the idea of being just good, because being just good, among other things, wins them admiration and respect. It can win them a sense of security. That inspirational quality is what any profession of moral instruction requires. It becomes part of the advertising strategy. And that's, I think, the aspect that Robert Jur is most cynical about. The same could be true. I mean, if you could have, let's say, any kind of advertising campaign based on inspiring people to be more like so-and-so, even, I mean, you know what? Let's talk about body image. Let's talk about, fitness culture. I think that's a great contemporary example. I think that for Robert Jur, I mean, there may be a difference in kind. I don't want to say there's no difference in kind, but there's less difference than you would think between admiring moral paragons and admiring certain kinds of physique that you want to emulate and invest a lot of money and time in trying to emulate. Fundamentally,
paragons of fitness.
Yeah, they're out there in the world. They're there. Don't you want to be like that? Wouldn't your life be worth living more if you were like that person, not like that other person? And so, like, you juxtapose, I don't know, before and after pictures, before and after somebody committed to this particular weight loss plan or workout plan. So in answer to what Richard is saying, if there's a problem with the fitness obsession, I think Robert Jur would say it's the same problem as Confucians face with their morality obsession.
Yeah, I guess, no, the fitness, that seems problematic. I suppose, ultimately, I wonder if the fundamental issue then is whether there really is this kind of hierarchy of goods or values in the way that I suppose Confucians or Mencius clearly think that there are, right? Because they think the noble and the virtues are higher ordered goods or something like that. Yeah, that's why I was wondering if that is really what is at heart, because if they're right about that, then it seems like they would be justified, if that was true, to say that, well, we should prioritize virtue or morality. So that's why I was wondering if Robert Jur's, one of his central criticism was the rejection of a hierarchy, at least as the way that the Confucians are affirming.
I think I would agree with that, at least for the moment. I mean, I think I see that as part and parcel of what I'm saying on Robert Jur's behalf when I say all of these desires are desires. Like one impulse is much like the next, from this organic point of view that Robert Jur seems to be taking up.
Yeah, and then finally, one more quick point. Then the other criticism is, but the Confucians are artificially constructing this kind of hierarchy, and Confucius is trying to sell morality as the highest good, but really for his own benefit or for power or something like that. I guess he's thinking of Confucius as being insincere, or he's really just self-interested. And that did kind of remind me of like the Nietzschean critique of like the priestly caste in the Genealogy of Morals, because on Nietzsche's view, the priests also construct this hierarchy or a kind of moral system of good and evil, and they kind of hoist it onto people to ultimately gain more power. And then because now they need to be the priests are central to that whole mode of life, and they gain certain kind of power because they don't have like the physical power of like the Greeks, right? So this is like their creative way of selling morality, but ultimately for their own kind of power and self-interest and benefit. That's all really there is to it. And so, I thought there was this kind of interesting analogous kind of stream of thought there.
Yeah, if you've read Nietzsche, it's hard not to see resonances with Nietzsche's critique in Genealogy of Morals, where he more or less presents people as adopting what he calls a slave morality, where you see it as a good thing if you, in some sense, enslave yourselves to these higher values, which end up serving the interests of other people rather well. Although Nietzsche's view, as I understand it, the problem is he's worried about a world where everyone has slave morality, and thus there's no one taking the lead.
Genealogy of Morals is incredibly fascinating. I love that text. And I definitely think it can be studied with great profit alongside the Zhuangzi in general, not just this bit of Zhuangzi. One sort of important conceptual difference I would point out between the general approach of the genealogy and this is that Nietzsche's really preoccupied with strength and weakness. I don't see a preoccupation with strength and weakness in this particular dialogue. I think there's a preoccupation with being real as we tiptoe into the topic of genuineness or authenticity, being real versus being sort of taken in by shallow displays.
Yeah.
So just like you can be taken in by shallow displays of certain kinds of physique, you can be taken in by shallow displays of conspicuous virtue. And other people can take advantage of your susceptibility to that in order to make a living from seeming to embody or have expertise in how to train you to be more like that kind of person.
Yeah, good. Well, I want to talk more about being real, and maybe we'll have a chance to do that at the end when we talk about our general takeaways. But I don't want to let go of Richard's worry that the picture of human nature here is a little bit suspect, because it seems like it's kind of a loner's lifestyle that he's recommending to people. And by that, I don't mean, and perhaps you took Richard to mean this, Stephen, that he just assumes people live relatively solitary lives, except for when they're absolutely dependent on a mother. I don't think he's ruling out the idea that people live in communities of some sort, but they don't have what we might call sort of pro-social desires, needs, emotions, that kind of thing, that then need to be expressed and fulfilled and gratified in order to make them a more complete human being. And there's at least some evidence for this view, and I want to mention it just in the interest of understanding the historical text, the text in its historical context. So if we go back to the state of nature, he says, of course, they knew who their mothers were, but not who their fathers were. They commingled with the bucks and does, right? Okay, so they're hanging out with animals, plowing for their food, weaving for their clothes, with no thought of harming or being harmed. Okay, so I think the point is that contrary to the view that we might associate with someone like Mencius, where people have these desires to be benevolent, here, the best we can say about people is that they're benign, not benevolent. That is, they don't mean to harm people. They don't have any desire to harm people. And thank God for that, right? That's a useful thing. But it isn't necessarily that they want other people to do well or flourish or what have you, or that they want to join others in joint projects, that kind of thing.
On behalf of Robert Jur, and I think a lot of critiques of Confucianism, such as those in Han Feizi, I want to intervene here and say, what if caring about other people looks really different in different circumstances? So take, for instance, the difference between benevolently caring about all mankind when you're only aware of there being a few million people in the world, Say you're from a particular part of the world where it's reasonable to construe the political community of mankind as relatively small in size versus today with many billions. Your sense of agency really changes. Your sense of like what it would take to be properly engaged with what kinds of systems. And I think that the typical Confucian and just broadly early Chinese moralistic perception of benevolence presupposes that you have kingdoms and empires. So the context you're talking about, like the mentioned Confucian context, it's mostly oriented toward people who intend to be social leaders in some way, gentlemen or above, advisors to kings, sometimes world-conquering kings themselves. The setting is already massively complex in terms of the exercise of force, different class distinctions, how the economy works and all of that. I think all you really need to appreciate how pro-social these people might be in Robert Jur's utopia is just to say none of it has happened yet. So using our own models of cultural evolution, we'd be thinking back to bands of a couple dozen human beings and asking, what is it like to be a benevolent person when your band has a couple dozen people in it? And that's really all you need to worry about for the next 10,000 years. It doesn't mean that they're not human. Just because Ren or benevolence doesn't turn into a sort of career-defining obsessive ambition, it's that there's no setting in which that would make sense for them.
Okay, good. So the next section is section 6, the final section, where we describe Confucius's retreat, more or less.
Okay, so this is Confucius finally retreating. He's humiliated, shaken, and he admits to his disciples that he underestimated Zhi's ferocity and power. And I'm going to give this closing quotation. Confucius says, "I am what they call someone who gets himself cauterized when he has no wound. I ran rashly over to pat the tiger's head and braid the tiger's whiskers, and narrowly escaped falling prey to that tiger mouth of his."
Yeah, what an interesting metaphor. So here he is getting cauterized, which for the people who aren't English speakers here is a way of saying getting his wound healed up, getting it closed so that he's no longer bleeding. But he doesn't in fact have a wound, right? He's not bleeding. So he's giving himself a treatment that he doesn't need, right? A medical intervention or treatment that he doesn't actually require. So that already is an interesting metaphor. And the second one is this tiger metaphor. He says, "I ran rashly over to pat the tiger's head and braid the tiger's whiskers, and narrowly escaped falling prey to that tiger mouth of his." So one question is, who's the tiger? And what does he mean, pat its head and braid its whiskers? So he's like trying to make it pretty. He's trying to make it more beautiful and also tame it. Maybe that's what patting the head is supposed to imply.
My interpretation is pretty simple. In fact, I want to ricochet off a phrase or something that one of you said a few minutes ago of basically turning the tiger into a house cat. Turning the tiger into a house pet is one interpretation of what Confucius is trying to do whenever he approaches any of these men who do not listen to him. Because remember, Robert Jur is just the latest of several people Confucius has gone to, several predatory people who are in a position to wreak a lot of harm and do regularly wreak a lot of harm. Confucius makes his appeal, tries to sort of acquaint the predator with the delights of life in a house and life eating kibble or something. And the predator is like, nope. And one reason I find this so fascinating is that if we sort of zoom out from the focus on individual moral cultivation and Confucianism and look at its political objectives, and if we zoom out even further and think about moral activists, moral reformers in any time and place who typically have socio-political objectives at some level, I think one thing you could generalize is that any moral socio-political agenda will involve doing something about those predatory individuals, whoever they may be in a particular social structure, whatever levers of power they happen to be wielding such that people are suffering. Moral activism aims at changing them, at either getting rid of them in some fashion or causing them to change how they behave. And Confucius in particular is trying to change how these people behave. Zhi tried to get rid of one of them, and we saw how that wound up. Confucius doesn't try to get rid of them. He tries to change how they behave. But assuming that these predators are even remotely competent and astute, they're already experts at what they care about doing. And so the blandishments of becoming a house pet, and if we want to think about moral reform in general as sounding like that to predatory ears, those are going to be deaf ears that those pitches are falling on.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
I was just reminded of, so we did this episode in about chapter 4 of the Zhuangzi, where Yan Hui is going to go try to do good by, who was he trying to convert? The ruler of Wei, right? And and in that dialogue.
Yeah, this child ruler who's petulant and impulsive and that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And then Yan Hui's like, I'm going to become humble. And then basically Confucius just shoots him down and says, none of that stuff is going to work. and ultimately undergo a fasting of the heart. And anyway, it's a pretty dense passage that, we can't talk about right now fully. But yeah, I had this quick thought that, after this encounter with Robert Zhi, actually the chapter 4 is really about Confucius post Robert Zhi encounter. And he's come to also think maybe moral activism isn't really the right path.
But notice on that reading, which I really like, Confucius ultimately doesn't tell Yan Hui not to go. So once again, it's a radically individualized challenge. Like, you, sir, who are trying to make something of your life, do you know what you are doing? How realistic are your tactics? Yan Hui ultimately is given full permit. I mean, maybe Confucius knows he can't stop him, but he doesn't try to stop him that hard. He just keeps saying in that chapter 4 dialogue, no, that's not going to work. No, that's not going to work either. You need a radically different approach. Which again, is not a condemnation of the project of changing that ruler's behavior. It's just a very skeptical ear listening to all of the proposals for how to do it effectively.
Right. So to underscore something you just said, Stephen, in that chapter 4 dialogue between Confucius and Yan Hui, ultimately Confucius does endorse this idea that Yan Hui go to the state of this terrible ruler, but not with any particular agenda to persuade him. But he still goes, right? All right, so if it's all right with you, I'd like to kind of step back a little bit and talk about what it is that we're supposed to take away from this dialogue, or how it is that we're supposed to understand this story more generally. And I feel like in some sense, we should at least mention that there are other interpretations of this dialogue. There aren't that many people who write about it in English, but insofar as there is a kind of view about the Robert Zhi dialogue in English, one of those views goes something like this. What we see in the Robert Zhi dialogue is a slightly different iteration of an old theme. And that theme is back to nature, shed all the so-called benefits of culture and civilization, and return to this sort of primitive state. Maybe we'd add to that usual so-called primitivist or naturalist picture that you should also adopt a kind of enlightened self-interest, that you should seek your own best interest, understood correctly in this way that's basically concerned with the satisfaction of bodily desires and that sort of thing, basic goods and long life and so on. That's a certain interpretation that people nowadays, perhaps most those who particularly who follow the sinologist and philosopher A.C. Graham, call Yangist. They associate it with this mysterious teacher who seems to be an opponent of Mencius named Yang Zhu, who's sometimes described as a egoist, sometimes described as a privativist. And we don't actually have any text that we can attribute to Yang Zhu with any confidence, so it's all a bit speculative. But anyway, regardless of what we call it, Yangist or something else, maybe we should just call it naturalist in this other sense, this kind of back to nature sense of naturalism. That's another very tempting reading of the text, especially when you look back at the description of the Golden Age, which seems to sort of idealize people living in the state of nature in ways that seem to be quite good for them. That's a time before war and oppression and that kind of thing. But what I see from you, Stephen, both from the piece that you wrote and also from our discussion today, is something that plays up another aspect of the dialogue, which I'm going to call the moral charlatan view, according to which we have these teachers of morality or purveyors of morality more broadly, who are kind of charlatans. They present morality as something that's good for you and, it's something that's virtuous in its own right, when in fact really providing you with these values that will help them profit in their own way and perhaps serve the ruling class in various ways. So it's a kind of victimizer critique of Confucianism and not a kind of back to nature naturalist critique of Confucianism. Are those two interpretations in tension as you see it?
I think in any exceptionally rich and thought-provoking piece of ancient literature, the scholar learns how to distinguish, on the one hand, what the fictional character is actually saying, from, on the other hand, where their own sort of richest philosophical reconstruction is taking the words. I'm invested in certain conceptual potentials that I think are evident in the dialogue. I think that it's really difficult to nail down what the character Robert Zhi is standing for. So one of the interpretations of this text that I really like that I've read, there aren't that many out there, as you said, is by Hans-Georg Müller and Paul D'Ambrosio in their book, Genuine Pretending. And one, as I struggle to be able to summarize that book with literally no notice, because I didn't realize I was going to try. You know what? I'm not going to summarize it. It's brilliant. People should read it. It's a very eccentric take on what Zhuangist writing does. My own inadequate summary would be, for them, Zhuangist writing does not present any of its characters as exemplars or fit for emulation. It engages in all kinds of rhetorical and narrative strategies to undermine and parody our obsession with finding somebody to admire. And one adjective they use when talking about Robert Jurr and other texts is carnivalesque. There's a kind of madcap quality to what's going on. There's a lot of humor in the text that we're not really able to touch on in this short compass. So interpreting Robert Jurr as a man, I mean, it's a literary question at least as much as a philosophical one. In terms of his claims, in terms of what he says, and how I can make best sort of rational reconstruction of what he says, the core concern is that people are fragile and appetitive organisms. And that core concern means that people's ambitions and people's agendas and people's ideals are at some level always answerable to questions like, how does that make you feel? And are you actually able to do that? The fact that we're fragile organic beings entails all kinds of constraints on sort of how much sense it makes to pursue a certain course in life. And I mean, this is probably one reason that this text has been packaged in the Zhuangzi, as opposed to in any other anthology that we have from Chinese antiquity. I mean, it's pretty eccentric in the context of the Zhuangzi, but it resonates with a lot of the themes. And the theme I'm thinking of most focus at the moment is that people are astonishingly shallow a lot more of the time than they think they are. And they're astonishingly shallow, especially when they take themselves to be most serious. That's why, to go back to the Muller and D'Ambrosio book, Genuine Pretending, they put so much emphasis on how funny Zhuangist writing is. Like, certain kinds of interpreters, myself included, often skate past the humor because, being serious-minded, I want to get to the real pith and the marrow. But what if the pith and the marrow is funny? I mean, that by itself is a radically disruptive way of doing philosophical writing. And I think that to tie a bow around this and make it explicitly about Robert Jurr, I think that for this text, there's almost an inverse relationship between the self-importance someone has and how seriously they can be taken.
Yeah.
Whether or not they're being honest. I mean, so to use the victim-victimizer distinction you used earlier, I think plenty of people who teach morality are themselves victims, sort of adopting Robert Jurr's framework. They don't all have to be cynical operators. They can be former dupes themselves. Maybe this can lead us into the quote you wanted to read from my earlier published piece.
Yeah, I would like to read that. Give me a second, though, if you don't mind. I'm sorry I can't let this go, but it seems to me when I read the text that there's certain language that you see in old texts that are somewhat in the neighborhood of Taoist or Yangist literature that talks a lot about genuineness and being true to your nature. And you see echoes of that language in this passage, especially in the more philosophical parts of Robert Jurr's speech, talking about being genuine. There's that part where he says of the great sage kings of the past, normally credited for bringing about golden ages, he says, but how should we assess them? All of them confused what was genuine in them for the sake of some sort of advantage or profit, and forced themselves into opposition with their own innate dispositions and inborn natures. That is the kind of conduct that is truly worthy of shame. So he's saying something like this: I stand for being true to your nature and not distorting or corrupting or warping your nature as one does when one starts to perceived advantage or profit. And so that sounds to me like the old back to nature naturalism that I was talking about before. And I actually think it's quite possible that view, that reading of the text is compatible with yours, Stephen. I just wondered why it is that it seemed like you weren't playing it up. Is it bother you? Are you uncomfortable with it or something? Or
there are only so many hours we have in front of these microphones.
Okay. Yeah.
I'll try to say something fruitful. So the thing about harmony, as anybody knows who loves the Analects, is that harmony is not unison. It's not, I mean, maybe technically unison is one form of harmony, but you know what I'm saying. Two things have to be different before they can be in harmony. The thing I want to add to what you're saying, or maybe come at it from a different angle, is that Robert Jurr does pursue profit. It's part of what makes the dialogue so magical is that the guy is a brutal crime lord who is constantly pillaging and has, 9,000 armed men under him who presumably fear him, otherwise they'd take him out. I mean, he is in no way the kind of character you would write if your intention was to make this go down as smooth as you possibly could and have the reader automatically accept what he's saying. And like, in particular, if Robert Jurr is saying things like, people get caught up in all of these insane fixations that prevent them from living out their nature. I mean, it's entirely possible. Again, not certain, but it's possible that Robert Jurr is doing a pretty good job of living out his nature through living the way that he does. The issue is
Mhm.
that when he perceives profit and loss, when he perceives danger and safety, he's relatively accurate in his perceptions.
Yeah.
Whereas someone like Confucius or somebody who's been bamboozled by Confucius is not so accurate in their ability to
Yeah.
perceive where profit actually lies.
Yeah, that's right. So recalling the Chinese text, it sometimes seems like he's distinguishing between this phrase appears that could be translated as something like great profit or the sort of overly broad conception of profit, da li, right? That's the wrong kind of profit to pursue. And then there's this other kind of profit that he's perfectly willing to pursue, which is, I want to say, something like enlightened self-interest, understood as profit, sort of narrowly construed as being the satisfaction of relatively limited bodily desires or something.
Yeah, we can think about the runaway quality that the pursuit of wealth and power tends to
Yeah.
have. So, like, we're all very familiar with there being people for whom no amount of wealth and power is
Yeah.
enough. Robert Jur is proud of not being that kind of person. Robert Jur is
Yeah.
proud of the fact that, like, he's moderate and self-possessed in his pursuit of profit, which means he would never seek aristocratic title or to become a general of a real army instead of a bandit army. Because people who actually seek that out are immoderate in their pursuit of profit.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That again echoes what I'm thinking of as the back to nature naturalism that you sometimes see in these old Taoist texts and perhaps Youngist texts too. All right. So we want to be sure to recommend Stephen's wonderful piece on the Robert Jur dialogue. Actually, we just mentioned it earlier. There isn't that much written on Robert Jur, but Stephen's article is one of the few pieces that gives us an account from beginning to end. He has an interesting question that he poses about this victim-victimizer kind of model or account of moral projects as they're presented in the text. So I'm going to read from his article. He says, who exactly benefits in concrete and verifiable terms from your participation in collective moral projects? When those projects feature charismatic leaders and opportunities for gain, what assurance can you find that any given representative is not a pawn, a victim of a pyramid scheme, or indeed a would-be victimizer? So he's trying to say, think about who it is that's going to benefit from your adoption of a particular moral framework or moral way of life. And when you look at those leaders and you look at these moral values, it's hard not to see yourself as a kind of victim of a pyramid scheme.
So, whatever Robert Jur, the fictional character, like whatever tone he would use while asking such a question, the tone that I use while asking the question is a non-rhetorical tone. It's meant to be an open question that can be answered honestly, but answering it is challenging. And answers to it are going to be very idiosyncratic. It's basically a question that I think that the text can teach us to ask ourselves.
So you don't think it's just obvious that the people who benefit, say, are the landed nobility or the wealthy or the powerful or what have you?
I mean,
It's
in
just,
contexts like ours, media companies, political campaigns, other interest groups.
okay.
Right. I don't think it's obvious that in every single case, somebody who buys into a moral agenda is one of those three things, or indeed more than one of those three things: pawn, victim of a pyramid scheme, or would-be victimizer. I think it's entirely possible that that is not true of everyone. The issue, though, is that it's hard to tell unless you ask it seriously. Because
Yeah.
the technology of whipping up moral enthusiasm has always been extremely sophisticated technology. That's one way I think. I mean, I initially wrote this in a context, 5 years or so ago, when I was extremely vexed by the sheer efficacy with which my own moral feelings could be whipped up by social media and news media and by the people around me all sort of agreeing to sort of affirm and deny things, not in lockstep with each other, but in a sort of madcap rhythm, according to a certain kind of news cycle, all of which struck me as incredibly heteronymous. That's a very
Meaning,
highfalutin word, like not in any of our hands.
yes.
That was sort of the initial human context for my being interested in writing that piece in the first place. Translating forward into the present, or indeed translating into any context whatsoever, Robert Jur is talking about the fact that in 500 BC in China, the technology of moral manipulation is very sophisticated. And the reason the technology of moral sophistication was sophisticated then, just like it is now, is that people want to be good. And they want to be good in a way that, when you analyze it, frequently looks incredibly disappointing and shallow because it's based so much on reputation and on unrealistic schematic understandings of what people are like and of how events play out in the world.
Yeah. Okay, that brings me to a question for you, Stephen, that I think you begin to address in the article. but I wonder if you could elaborate on it a little bit. And that is basically, what does it mean precisely to take what Robert Jur says seriously? So there's a temptation to read the text, as I understand it, as recommending a way of life to us. And that's the kind of so-called back to nature naturalist reading of the text, where it says, okay, leave civilization, go back to the time when people hung out with deer and what have you and knew their mothers but not their fathers, and plow your own land, weave your own shoes and clothing, and live that way. But I take it you don't see that as Robert Jur's recommendation.
Not in the slightest.
Okay.
I mean, so again, Robert Jur, the character, is carnivalesque. I mean, and
he's a spectacle. We're not supposed to emulate him. We're not necessarily supposed to live like him, right?
I think the text is too sophisticated to be presenting anybody as worthy of emulation. That's like my phrasing of what you said back at the beginning, which is that they both come off as bad people. I'm not so comfortable with that language, but I am comfortable saying neither one of them is being presented as particularly suitable for emulation. And in terms of, again, many interpretations are welcome in any conversation about a text of this nature. Like the interpretation I find myself settling on of what Robert Jur says. So if the question is, what does this amount to in practice? Or what would it look like to sort of live out these values? It has to do with a kind of radically concrete attentiveness toward how people feel and to what they are doing and to what the relationship is between what they're doing and how they feel. Now, once again, it's a spectacle and it's funny to have a cannibalistic mob boss saying that. It's interesting when you try to figure out how him sort of taking those ideas seriously himself has led him to where he is in life, and how taking the ideas with equal seriousness yourself might take you in a completely different direction. Because, and again, it is in the Zhuangzi anthology, whatever that might mean. And, quote unquote, Taoist is a very vexed, complex concept. But a lot of what people call Taoist, quote unquote, in these early texts has to do with framing what is best in life in radically concrete terms and organic terms, and being impatient with moral ideals for reasons X, Y, and Z. I think what taking Robert Jur seriously can help us do is to cultivate a kind of readiness to see through bullshit.
I guess one thing that is really difficult, though, is how we feel and like what we perceive or see is theory laden, right? So I don't know if there is like a bare fact of how we feel depending on some set of actions. I mean, it depends on our worldview and deeper fundamental principles and commitments. And so someone could be kind of moralized, or I guess Shunzi has a passage like this, right? Where once you become ritualized and your character transforms, then what you see as profitable will be radically changed. And so you kind of see this in, like, for example, Iris Murdoch too, like, when you get transformed in who you are, or if you really gain the virtues, then Murdoch thinks that how you see things, like the normative significance, radically shifts. And so someone who sees a child suffering might not think that gives you a reason to really do much. But someone with an ethical framework who's been changed might have a very different view about what reasons there are and so on. So already it seems like there's some deep challenges here about what is the direction that we ought to go? And I don't think this dialogue is trying to answer that question really, but even that question itself is really difficult to answer.
Yeah, a possible criticism of the kind of Robert Jur worldview is that it assumes that it's relatively easy to see what sort of life is worth pursuing so long as you shed your blinders, so long as you're not taken in by these charlatans, these purveyors of morality, these teachers and so on, when in fact it may be, as Iris Murdoch suggests, very difficult to see, right?
Well, what happens when we frame this in terms of how people feel, instead of seeing that a way of life as good, which is very cognitive by comparison to how they feel at various points in their life?
Yeah, but how you even feel, like whether you feel proud or you feel good about what you've done, despite maybe physical pain, that will hinge quite a bit on the kind of person you want to be and your fundamental commitments, and whether you're willing to feel physical pain or suffer for the sake of some other kind of what you take to be a kind of noble end. So yeah, even the bare feeling will be very different, across different people, depending on their worldview.
Unless we flip the polarity and say that their worldview is more of a function of how they feel in certain situations than vice versa. Again, the text is not sophisticated enough to actually pursue a debate along those lines, but it seems to me a theoretical option in response to the kind of thing that you're saying. So at minimum, we might want to say there's a chicken and egg relationship or a sort of dog chasing its tail relationship between my articulate convictions about what is best in life and what my body is actually doing and telling me on a minute by minute basis. And if
Yeah, I guess the issue is whether even those bare kind of percepts or raw emotions, even those things are deeply transformed by like the whole sort of background presuppositions we have and our ethics, our views about values and what sort of life we should lead. But yeah, that's a real disagreement in philosophy of science about whether there are such just very fundamental, what is a sense data, right?
Yeah.
That is not connected to values or background theories.
Perception without concepts, which might mean perception without values or what have you, or conceptual frameworks. Right. Yeah. But in any case, I think we've said enough both to have given our listeners a good sense of how the dialogue goes, how unusual it is. And we've also thereby put into the ether the first sustained discussion of this puzzling, intriguing, strange dialogue. There's been a little written about it, as we mentioned, and we're going to cite the 3 or 4 major works that have discussed it in the past. But we now add another one to the record. And for that, we're very grateful to Stephen. Thanks so much for joining us, Stephen, today.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been great.
All right. So we'll say that was the way for today. 感谢你的收听. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.